Hi everybody, this is part 2 of the lecture called Making Sense of Arguments. And in this lecture, I'm going to go over some things that I didn't go over in the previous lecture. In particular, I'm going to go over these charts that explain all the possible ways in which you can have a deductive argument where you can mix and match a valid argument structure with true premises or false premises, and I'm going to explain why that chart is important and what kind of information it gives us about the nature of deductive arguments. And I'm going to do the same thing for inductive arguments, which have a similar chart. So we're on top of page 4 of our lecture notes, and the subsection is titled Chart of All Possible Deductive Arguments. And you'll notice that the chart consists of various arguments, and it's color-coded. The red arguments are all the deductive arguments that are bad for one reason or another, and I'll explain why they're bad in a minute. And then only one of them is any good. That's the argument that's in blue, and underneath that argument is what is called a sound argument, which is the best kind of deductive argument we can have. It's an argument where not only do you have a valid argument structure, but you also have all true premises, which I'm going to label as premises and then subscript it with a T, meaning true. And that's what is conveyed by this chart. Going down is all the different kinds of valid arguments. So these are all valid. On the other side, we have these invalid arguments. And then, as you'll notice, on the sides are all different ways we can have true and false premises. And all the ways in which we can combine true and false premises with valid or invalid argument structures is represented on this chart. And as you'll notice, there are a lot of ways of doing or giving a deductive argument badly. And there's only one way of giving a deductive argument well. And that is the kind of argument that you ultimately want at the end of the day. It's the argument that has the good logical structure, which we call validity, and you're also working with good information, all true premises. Now, in a valid argument, the idea is that, as I explained in the previous lecture, the idea is that the premises contain the conclusion. So, if all the premises of a valid argument are true, then because the conclusion is contained in a valid argument, you get the result that the conclusion is also going to be true. Another way of putting the idea of a valid argument is to say that a valid argument is truth preserving. So if you happen to be working with true premises, then with a valid argument, a true conclusion is going to be logically guaranteed. And this is precisely what is lacking in the case of an invalid argument. In an invalid argument, it's not truth preserving. So what you can have, in particular, this is the case that is going to be common for an invalid argument. You can work with true premises, but because an invalid argument structure is not truth preserving, you can end up with a false conclusion. Nonetheless, this chart represents all the ways you can have an invalid argument where you can have all true premises and luck out with a true conclusion. That's what we have here in this box. Here we have a typical case of an invalid argument where you start with true premises and then you end up with a false conclusion. In this case, we have an invalid argument with false premises and you luck out and have a true conclusion. And in the final case is where you have an invalid argument and everything is false. The point is, for each of the arguments that are in red, they're unacceptable, they're unsound, and they're unsound even when, if we go over to this argument here, even when the argument is valid, as this column here demonstrates, all of these are the valid arguments. These are all the invalid arguments. Even though you are working with a valid argument structure, if you are working with bad information, namely false premises, you're still not going to have a sound argument, which is the kind of argument you want for a deductive argument. Nonetheless, in this particular case, it's interesting in that you have a false premise and you still luck out with a true conclusion with a valid argument structure. However, it's still not an acceptable argument because the idea behind giving an argument is to prove that the conclusion is true on the basis of true premises. And the only case that we have in this chart is the one on the top left, where you prove that the conclusion is true on the basis of true premises. And that's precisely what is not happening here in this particular case. In the bottom left-hand corner argument, it's also a valid argument structure. So it's an argument structure that's truth-preserving, but as it happens, you happen to be working with false information and you end up with a false conclusion as well. So this chart really gives you a lot of information. It gives you all the ways in which you can have a valid argument structure with true premises and false premises. As you'll notice with an invalid argument, every true-false premise combination is possible. But that's not the case with a valid argument. This is left empty. This is the case where you have a valid argument structure and you have true premises and the possibility of a false conclusion. And the very way in which validity is defined is to prevent this from logically ever happening, because validity is defined as an argument where if the premises happen to be true, the conclusion is also guaranteed to be true. So this gray area is not filled in for lack of imagination or for laziness. It's not filled in because it's logically impossible given how validity is defined. Now in this chart we have something very similar. It's the chart of all possible inductive arguments, and just as in the case of deductive arguments, the good structure of a deductive argument is characterized by whether or not it is valid. In the case of an inductive argument, a strong argument is one where the premises support the conclusion with a high degree of probability, and that's what we have in this column. A weak inductive argument is where the premises support the conclusion with only a very low degree of probability. So, as with the chart on deductive arguments, this chart also has only one good kind of inductive argument, and that is the kind of inductive argument at the end of the day that you want. It's an argument that is cogent, and a cogent argument is one that has both a strong inductive argument structure plus all true premises. But as we saw with the case of all the possible ways of having a deductive argument. There are a lot of ways you can have a bad inductive argument, and only one way you can have a good inductive argument. A good inductive argument, as I said, is one that is cogent. It's got a strong argument structure, and all the information that you're working with in that argument happens to be correct or true. So the same distribution of true and false premises is applied to this chart as well. And in this top right-hand corner, we have a weak inductive argument. Weak because, let's just go through this argument. It says, some politicians are tall. The current vice president is tall. Therefore, the next vice president will be tall. The reason why this is a weak inductive argument is because it uses the word some. If you use the word some, it doesn't give you great confidence that the conclusion is going to follow, or it doesn't give you a great deal of support for the truth of the conclusion. So it's possible that the conclusion could turn out to be false, even though, for all we know, the conclusion could turn out to be true. The point is, though, that looks like a J. The point is that it doesn't matter because the argument structure is not acceptable, so you wouldn't want to accept this argument simply on the basis of its structure, its weak structure. And the same thing is also happening with the rest of the arguments below it. And just to go to the next argument, again, the word some is used. Some presidents have a law degree, a JD. The current president has a law degree. As it happens, this all happens to be true. So some presidents have a law degree. Our current president, Barack Obama, also has a law degree. Is it likely that the next president will have a law degree? It's hard to know. We don't know. But on the basis of the word some, it doesn't give us great confidence that the conclusion is going to be well supported. So this is what makes it the case that we have a weak inductive argument. Unlike here, on the other side, where we have a strong inductive argument, which is characterized in terms of most past presidents. Let's look at this one here. Most presidents were tall. The current president is tall, so the next president will be tall. Now again, we're working with false information in the premises. It's doubtful that most presidents were tall. A few of them were. So this is false. Nonetheless, given that the argument is in terms of most so-and-sos are such and such, and some individual is a so-and-so, then it would follow with a high degree of probability that that individual is a such and such. So this is going to follow with a high degree of probability thanks to its strong inductive argument structure. Same thing for the final argument here. Same thing for the argument here. Again, as for this gray box, it's going to be empty because of the way strength for an inductive argument is defined. In the definition of strength, you're not going to have true premises that probably lead to a false conclusion. The point of having a strong inductive argument is so that you can have a conclusion that is supported with a high degree of probability, as opposed to a low degree of probability, which is what we have with a weak inductive argument structure. And so it's going to be ruled out as impossible by definition where you have true premises in a strong inductive argument, and the conclusion follows with weak inductive strength. In other words, that possibility is going to be ruled out, which is a good thing, because what you want in an inductive argument is for the strong inductive argument structure to preserve or to support the probability of the truth that you're working with in the premises. So this chart, again, as with the previous one, has a lot of information in it, and it's going to pay off a great deal for you to really hunker down and sit down and look at every single case, every single argument, and every way of combining structure with true and false premise combinations to really understand what you can have and can't have with inductive arguments.